statistics tell us that almost 30% of the United States population will probably be affected at one point in their lifetime by something which is classified as general anxiety disorder. And generally, at any given time, 12% of the American population is assumed, whatever, to be suffering from this general anxiety disorder, meaning not just nervous about, am I going to get to the bus today, or am I going to this, but as we said before, something which is more, the feelings are much more exaggerated. The anxiety is much greater. The dread is much more severe than the situation seems to warrant. And obviously in such a situation, a person would obviously require professional assistance. In January of 2014, Scott Stossel, who is currently and is currently the editor of The Atlantic, a graduate of Harvard University, he published his memoir called My Age of Anxiety. And in it, he writes very interesting, which I think is an important point that a Rav could utilize. He speaks how his therapist, who he refers to as Dr. W. Dr. W is always pointing out to me, I survived my wedding, I've managed so far to remain productive, gainfully employed for more than 20 years, despite often debilitating anxiety. Scott, he says, over the last few years, you've run a magazine, edited many of its cover stories, worked on your book, taken care of your family, coped with the destruction of your house, and dealt with the normal vicissitudes and challenges of life. I pointed out to him that I managed all this only with the help of sometimes heavy medication, and that anything I've accomplished has been accompanied by constant worry and frequent panic, and has been punctuated by moments of near complete breakdown that leave me always at risk of being exposed to the anxious weakling that I feel I am. So his doctor replied, you have a handicap, anxiety disorder, yet you manage it, and I would say even thrive despite it. I still think we could cure you of it, but in the meantime, you need to recognize that given what you're up against, you've accomplished a lot. You need to give yourself more credit. And that's an important point that I think a Rav can also transmit to a person when it comes to anxiety. They probably accomplished, and they probably are accomplishing, a lot more than they give themselves credit for. You also, the Rav can tell them they're not alone. Indeed, probably the greatest contribution that Scott Stossel made to the study of anxiety was a successful, frankly, very well-respected and well-known literary personality, came, quote-unquote, out and admitted how he suffered with extremely debilitating, sometimes anxiety, but nevertheless, he was an extremely professional individual. But I'd like to take it one step further. He points out also in the book that current research tells us that anxiety may also be tied both to ethical behavior and to effective leadership. He points out, I suspect because it may be that my anxiety leads me to be an inhibition and a social sensitivity that makes me more attuned to other people and a more tolerable spouse than I otherwise would be. He goes on to say, anxious people, because they are vigilantly scanning the environment for threats, tend to be more attuned than adrenaline junkies to other people's emotions and social signals. Which means to say, he's saying that he thrived not in spite of his anxiety, but he thrived specifically because of his anxiety. And honestly, I believe very strongly that anxiety, notwithstanding the pain that accompanies it, has to be understood as from us as B'nai Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, as frankly as a nisayon, but a nisayon like Avram Avinu had. It's also a nisayon is painful, but it's also an opportunity for growth. And it's specifically the Nisayan if Hashem is, doesn't mean you shouldn't get help, doesn't mean you shouldn't try to alleviate it. But nevertheless, the recognition that the anxiety could possibly and potentially be that actual force what propels you into success and is actually a gift is something which I think is extremely liberating. I know a Rav. I know a Rav who, he has suffered from anxiety. And he doesn't make it public, but he lets people know that he suffers from anxiety. And he started to get calls from yeshiva bachrim all over the country. From Telz, Chicago at 11 o'clock at night, from BMG, from Beis Medrash Kavod at 11 o'clock at night. Bachrim would call him and tell him that they're suffering from anxiety, but they're too embarrassed to speak about it in the yeshiva, too embarrassed to speak about it with their mashgiach. And they heard that this Rav speaks about it, could you please help them? Interesting, this Rav who, again, he's certainly not a person who likes to brag, but he's already finished Shas. He's a very competent, seemingly Rav of a shul. He contributes a column to one of the most widely read Orthodox publications in the world. He's published books. He's been a scholar in residence in LA, Denver, Miami, Chicago. He runs an anonymous support group for Hasidic women in Kiryas Yoel who are survivors of incest and other sexual horrific acts. And with all of that, he actually still attempts to be a good husband, good father, and a good grandfather. But like I said, he never boasts about these accomplishments. But I wanted to mention his accomplishments right now to drive home a point. I wanted to drive home the point that for those of you here in the audience who feel helpless or hopeless, who feel that, the pain and the dread is sometimes overwhelming, you should know that there's other people out there. And they have the same suffering as you. And they have the same pain as you. But nevertheless, and you probably can count yourself in that if you would make the same proper din v'cheshbon, the same accounting, that you've accomplished a lot more than you ever imagined. Now, I just want to end by saying, perhaps people are thinking that it's a nice story I told, Rabbi Shemaisa, a certain Rav, and this, but I want to just tell you, in all honesty, that I can attest to the fact that everything I told you about the Rav is 100% true. Because it happens to be that I am that Rav.
Message about the right time to consult a Rav, the message about having a Rav, the message about a husband and wife having the same Rav, a message about a time to consult a mental health professional, and certainly a very, very strong positive message that people with anxiety can be most successful, very successful, and a reflection that a person, not in spite of anxiety, but because of their anxiety and the strength of their anxiety, becomes a very successful person. Thank you very much. Rabbi Eisenman. like to introduce you once again. I remind anyone who has a question to please fill out a card. When we're collecting the cards, if you have a question or comment, please hold up your hand. We'll collect it, and we'll get to questions after our speakers. I'd like to introduce Dr. David Rosmarin, who will speak about clinical perspectives and treatment approaches of anxiety. Dr. Rosmarin is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, every mother's dream. Founder director of the Center for Anxiety, with offices in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Rockland County. Dr. Rosmarin is a board-certified psychologist, a clinical innovator, and prolific researcher who has authored over 60 peer-reviewed publications, 100 scientific abstracts, and a recent book titled Spirituality, Religion, and Cognitive Behavior Therapy, a Guide for Clinicians. Dr. Rosmarin provides behavior therapy for patients presenting with anxiety, affective personality, and other disorders. Dr. Rosmarin's work has received media attention from ABC, NPR, Scientific American, The Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. Ladies and gentlemen, and for those who may not have seen it, it's not often that we comment on an excellent article in the New York Times. Today there was really a beautiful story about how Shmira in Pittsburgh is taking place and the sensitivity of everyone involved in this very difficult time. And it was really beautifully written for all of us to learn from and to understand. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. David Rosmarin.
Thanks very much. Appreciate the introduction, gracious words. That is a very hard act to follow, Rabbi Israel, I gotta tell you. But I will try. I do want to thank Sibby Ryder for inviting me to be a part of this panel here on anxiety disorders. I'm very grateful to have Ohel as our neighbors here. I do have an office here at the Center for Anxiety. We're only a couple blocks away on Bedford Avenue.
Can't hear you.
You can't hear me. Well, that's a problem. How about now? What I was saying is that I'm grateful to have Ohel as my neighbor here in Brooklyn. Our Brooklyn office is on Bedford between Kings Highway and Avenue P, pretty close. There's a pretty cheap cab on the way over here, so I appreciated that. Okay, so true to the name of tonight's event, we do truly live in a very, very complex world, and it's becoming exceedingly more complex by the day. It does take further genuine striving to achieve and to maintain peace of mind in this day and age. That is the reality that we are living. In fact, I think the world is becoming so incredibly complex that without sufficient knowledge, which doesn't have to be in depth, but it does have to be a mastery of this, and an event like tonight is probably enough to at least equip you with some basic ideas. But not only to have the knowledge, a concerted effort as well. Without knowledge and an effort, it's almost impossible to live without anxiety in the modern age. I want to provide a little bit of context, a little bit of statistical information. Rabbi Eisenman, you spoke about generalized anxiety disorder, and I want to broaden it. Let's go to the National Institute of Mental Health. In this day and age, 19.1% of Americans, countrywide, adults, that's nearly 1 in 5, have a full-blown anxiety disorder in every given year. Nearly 1 in 5 American adults. And nearly 1 in 4 of those cases, so 1 in 20 people about, is a severe case where the individual is literally not able to function day to day because of their symptoms. Over the lifetime, it's even worse. That's only in a 1 year, like the last 12 months. Over the lifetime, it's much worse. We're looking at 41.7% of Americans at some point will have a diagnosable anxiety disorder simply by statistics alone. That's 2 in 5. That'd be like this entire side of the room. That's all it meant, but whatever.